Hi, everybody. Just like to, my name is Joan Hopkins, and I'd like to welcome you all to COP26, our webinar on the last chance to avert climate disaster. I can't actually believe I'm saying those words, but it is true and it is real. So I'd like to thank our panel today, this evening, for joining us. We have Sinead Mercier, Ailbhe Smith, Jamie Gorman and Jennifer Whitmore. And we also have Dylan Murphy. He's going to be coming to us live from COP26. So we're going to have a short video from him, first of all. And we're going to have a really interesting debate. And at the end, there'll be opportunity for Q&A. And so it's going to be a really interesting evening. And also just to remind everybody to get us trending with the hashtag SocDems for climate justice and hashtag COP26. And to remind everyone that this is also a call to action. We'll be looking to get people out on the streets on Saturday morning, Saturday noon, Garden of Remembrance. Okay, so Sinead, if you'd like to take it away.
Classic on mute, but anyway, thank you very much, Joan. Delighted to be here today, and I'm really delighted as well to see this event being hosted by the SocDems during the conference too. And hopefully I'll be able to give you kind of maybe a brief overview of what it is that the UNFCCC and the COP26 is part of. So the COP26 is this year is called the Conference of the Parties. It's the 26th iteration of the 26th conference that has happened since the UNFCCC was established in 1992, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And basically what that is a overarching kind of legal framework for climate action to be dealt with. And there was previously the Kyoto Protocol, which was sort of the part of the agreement with teeth, which countries in 1997 came together to agree upon a way to cut their emissions in a kind of in a manner that was not only kind of in line with keeping global emissions below global warming at the kind of threshold of global warming at that time, but also as well that it would be done in a manner that was fair and just in terms of the term common but differentiated responsibilities. So that's a very important phrase. It's basically climate justice, which is this idea that some countries and some kind of lifestyles, such as the wealthy, have contributed more to climate change than others. And therefore those countries and those persons should take most of the action on board. And this has been a real sort of like point of conflict between countries. At the time they were split into two groups under the Kyoto Protocol. There was wealthier countries such as the EU, the US, Canada, and they were, because of their historical contribution to climate change since the Industrial Revolution, using fossil fuels to boost their economies, to bring kind of their populations out of poverty. They are under a severe and strong responsibility in keeping with climate justice to leave carbon space for poor developing countries who are still reliant on fossil fuels. So countries such as India at the time, China, who have much lower per capita emissions than the US, for example. You also have kind of countries which have negative emissions in parts of the world, places like Grenada in the Caribbean, who contribute 0.06% to carbon emissions, in places like Kenya as well. So those countries in the original Kyoto Protocol had this term of climate justice, where they did what they could, but the priority of the action was to be taken by the wealthy. So countries like Ireland, for example, countries that already had developed their economies and gained from the use of fossil fuels to develop since the Industrial Revolution. And they were also under the technology transfer agreement as well. And they were also asked to share kind of renewable technologies without any IP with developing economies as well, so that they could lift themselves out of poverty without having to rely on fossil fuels. Because of course we know fossil fuels are not kind of a prerequisite for development. There's plenty of other ways we can do it. The technology is there. It's just a means of kind of evenly distributing it and fairly and justly. And that kind of, I suppose, that kind of conflict and that these negotiations over time have kind of, this issue of climate justice has really kind of come to the fore again and again. And you can even see it in the media at the moment. The conversation's all about China, conversations all about India, and you know, sort of, rather than maybe looking at the US, which is a tiny proportion of the world's population as compared to the massive amount of carbon emissions that it actually emits. And I suppose the Paris Agreement was the first time that all countries had to take action, and all countries had to develop nationally determined contributions, and they all had to contribute in an equal, more or less equal manner to the task. However, when all those nationally determined contributions have been added up, they don't lead us on a pathway to 1.5 degrees Celsius, so keeping emissions to 1.5. If we breach 1.5 or 2 degrees, but even 1.5, we'll lose whole small island states, for example. You'll already have severe drought and severe impacts on those already poor countries, countries that have barely contributed to climate change, yet will suffer its worst effects because of where they are on the equator or otherwise. And those nationally determined contributions, unfortunately, add up to 2.7 degrees warming, which is extremely dangerous. I mean, 2 degrees or 1.5 is already quite dangerous. But to reach 2 degrees, to almost 3 degrees warming, would lead to kind of what scientists call a fear of runaway climate change. So methane coming up from the ocean, or the polar ice caps melting to such an extent that methane is released from under the Earth's surface in the Arctic, and that might lead to a kind of runaway development with climate change. And I suppose the interesting thing about the current COP is that all the old arguments that came up around the Kyoto Protocol are starting again. So this idea of climate justice, the idea that you should have a rights-based approach to climate action, a social justice-based approach to climate action, also contained in the term just transition, but also climate justice is now in the preamble of the Paris Agreement as well, and human rights-based approaches. They were not taken in the beginning of the Kyoto Protocol or in the UNFCCC. I suppose at the time you're talking about the 1990s, you're also talking about a history in environmental law where it moved from banning things. So if you think of the Montreal Protocol, which was developed to stop the holes in the ozone layer, you might know it from school, maybe I'm pretty old now, but they simply banned under the Montreal Protocol a very similar agreement to the UNFCCC, where countries came together and banned CFCs, a particular type of chemical that was in aerosols, that was in refrigerants, that was in freezers. It was simply banned. However, there was one part of the US where the CFCs were phased out through a market mechanism. So basically, some companies reduced their use of CFCs in a cost-effective manner, and they sold the kind of extra space that they had, if you think of CFC space, to companies that had not yet phased out CFCs as quickly or in a cost-effective manner. And so that kind of trading scheme was then taken up by the US, and they basically effectively, to be basic about it, quite bullied the EU and the Global South into taking up an emissions trading scheme for carbon and for fossil fuels. You also have a lot of vested interest at COP as well, and from the fossil fuel industry too. So for example, the Australian pavilion at COP at the moment is sponsored by Santos, which is an oil and gas company. So you have a strong presence at these COPs of the oil and gas industry. I apologize for the noise. I don't know who's been doing it all night, the drilling, but hopefully it'll stop soon. But so that's kind of now there's a new emissions trading. That emissions trading scheme was implemented. It was called the Clean Development Mechanism. Ireland, and there's other forms of it as well, it was also entered into the EU framework. Despite them not liking it in the beginning, they would have preferred the banning of fossil fuels. But it was introduced as the emissions trading scheme, which has been working now at EU level for the last kind of 20 years and not really reducing emissions by much. And now this conversation about, should we trade a right to emit? Should there be a right for polluters and companies to emit and for rich countries to emit? Or should there be a right for the global south or for worst affected countries, or, you know, for a just transition from one age of man's history to the next? To quote the President Lopez of the Mexican government in the 1970s, this idea that fossil fuel reliant economies should support one another into a new age where people are catered for and cared for in the context of a Green New Deal or human rights based approach. But instead, environmental law has been kind of focused on this market mechanisms, kind of very sort of cost benefit approaches to environmental goods, which really cannot be counted, I suppose, in that sort of accountancy framework. There, you know, is a fox worth 10,000 for the economy? It's not really a proper, it gets lost in translation basically. So now with the new agreement, or with the Paris Agreement, we now have the same conversations with Article 6 and another global emissions trading scheme. We also have very interesting developments where global south countries are really pushing back for kind of a civil legal approach to climate change with the loss and damage mechanism. So science has now developed so well in climate science that we can actually link particular climate disasters to particular to countries or particular emissions and where they came from. And this development in climate science has led to, you know, countries who are facing cyclones, who are facing climate-induced disasters, to say, well, we should get compensation for this. This should be treated as a civil claim. And that, unfortunately, has been blocked by kind of wealthier countries, particularly the US, Russia, and kind of oil-producing states as well. And this is it's an interesting space for Ireland, I think. I think we're in a really powerful position in one way, interestingly, because and it's quite controversial, and I'd love to hear people's opinions on it. But one kind of thing that's come up again and again is this idea that we ban fossil fuel infrastructure. So we ban the building at a supply side of fossil fuels. So you don't end up with a situation under the current UNFCCC framework where emissions are counted where they are consumed, rather than where they are produced. So Scotland, for example, in the UK, can be a leader in offshore wind and in climate action, while also being a massive exporter of oil and gas, and Norway is similar as well. But because agriculture in Ireland is counted at the kind of production side, that leads to an interesting conversation, because we can see the impacts of that in Ireland. It's similar in some ways to China, where kind of the goods of the world, or like the products of the world, are produced in China, though they are consumed elsewhere. So the emissions are counted in China. Is there a way for us to kind of not only deliver a just transition for farmers and have that conversation, but also bring to the world arena a conversation about those supply side kind of fossil fuel developments? Because we don't have a strong fossil fuel industry. We're lucky in that respect in terms of our climate action. Is there a way that we can be a leader in the world in banning offshore oil and gas exploration, in banning new fossil fuel infrastructure, in taking that command and control approach, like the Montreal Protocol, to climate action? Is there a way we can bring a human rights element to this and treat it as a civil or criminal justice matter, just like the climate case? And that'd be something that I would be very excited to talk about and learn from, and of course, listen to critique and criticism of that as well. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Sinead. That was absolutely fascinating. I have a million questions, but I'm not allowed to ask too many questions, or even one. So I forgot to introduce the video, so sorry. We're just going to do Dylan now. He's coming from the COP26, so we're just going to bring him in. And just to say to you, Sinead, I do remember the 90s. I joined Greenpeace in 1990, had my first march against DuPont in 91. So, you know.
Ah, very good. Actually, yeah, I don't know if people remember all the children's books in the 90s from Ireland, and they were amazing. They were all about environmental justice and climate action and stuff.
Bring them all back.
Bring them all back. The 90s were great.
Yeah. I don't know if this video is coming up. Oh, yeah.
Hey, Dylan here. I'm at COP right now in Glasgow in the Green Zone, and yeah, I'm a member of the National Executive of the Social Democrats, and also an activist involved with Not Here, Not Anywhere, who campaign for a fossil-free future in Ireland and across the world, a grassroots organisation. And I'm actually here in the Green Zone, so there's two different zones. The Green Zone's open to the public, and that's where we have our exhibition, and we're talking to members of the public about our campaign group and what we do. And then there's the Blue Zone, and we have one pass to the Blue Zone, and that's where the kind of substantive kind of discussions happen between the civil servants of the different nations, and the plenary meetings happening, and that kind of aspect of COP happens. It's kind of interesting because they're both quite separate, not just in physical distance, but also the attendees that are allowed in and the limitations of the attendees. So there's kind of divide to a certain degree within COP. And it's going quite well in terms of engagement from the public. There's not a massive amount of grassroots organisations that are represented. A lot of big corporate entities that have stalls here in the Green Zone. But we've had some great engagement at COP. So we're looking forward to the Saturday. That's when there's going to be a big, huge protest. And Greta Thunberg is going to be there as well to protest. And yeah, it seems like to a certain degree the grassroots and the people and the activists are to some degree getting alienated from the actual negotiations themselves. And some of the most important leadership is happening on the streets, which is not too much of a surprise, I guess. And the Social Democrats were very used to getting involved in the various campaigns, the pressure, the government itself to make the decisions to enact the policies that we fight for a social democratic future. So yeah, follow me on Instagram anyway, and you can keep in touch with what's going on here at COP. And best of luck in this discussion. I can't wait to watch it later. See you now.
So that was Dylan there, and the leadership, real leadership on the streets. Couldn't agree more. So Ailbhe, you're up next.
Thank you very much, Joan, and thank you very much to the Soc Dems for asking me to be here on this panel along with you this evening. I also want to say a very big thank you. I know that you're sending a speaker to the big, huge, as Dylan would put it, the big, huge mobilisation I hope we're going to have in Dublin on Saturday, and we're delighted that there'll be a Social Democrat speaker there. And also, incredibly importantly, you're sending stewards. Thank you very much. And, you know, it was really such a pleasure to listen to Sinead, who is so thoughtful and so incredibly well informed. And I feel is, you know, one of those voices that has been there, not for an incredibly long time, because when I look at you and I think, oh my gosh, you know, but I do, I have, like so many people, been following and listening and reading over the past decade, or maybe longer back even to the 90s, to what's happening to our planet and what's happening with the climate and environment, and being aware of it, but not actually doing very much. So I, in a way, don't stand, but rather sit before you this evening as someone who is saying, I've come to this incredibly late. And there is a part of me that, you know, it feels really quite guilty about that. But guilt, as Audre Lorde, the great Black American activist, said, guilt is an unproductive emotion. So I try and push it aside. And I say, there's no point in lingering over the guilt, because now is the important time. And however worried and anxious I feel, and I do feel worried and anxious, however worried and anxious I feel, I say there is still time. There is still time. We can change the way in which the world is directed. We can actually set things to right and try, I suppose, really to create a way of living in the world which is quite different. And I might come back to that point before I finish. But I have to say that over the past year or so, I have genuinely been motivated by this sense of, as the COP26 coalition puts it, that Dylan was talking about there in the great video, the time really is running out for the planet, and that the clock is ticking. We're into this kind of wind down time. We have absolutely got to act now with all urgency. It's a scientific fact. It's also a very obvious human fact when we see what has been happening all around the world over the past several years with increasing frequency. And I was really struck just last week when the United Nations, which is not an organization given to exaggeration. I spend most of my life thinking, will they not come out and say something specific and hit the nail on the head and do something real to change the world? But the United Nations actually said we are now already at code red. So we are on the countdown. And that really struck me very strongly, that we are now seeing major, what you might think of establishment agencies and groupings internationally, political groupings coming out and saying this is code red. So I'm speaking very much as an activist who has come late and lately to the issue, but with no less passion, I can tell you, because I do have this now sense of obligation and responsibility as somebody who is definitely, I was one of the ones cocooned for a long time, let me put it that way. It's the shorthand for saying I'm an older person, but I have children, one child, I have grandchildren. And it is the thought of the world, the planet, that would be my legacy and that of my generation, that really fills me with horror and shame, and that we simply have to do something about it. And it's perfectly clear, Sinead has given us the facts so elegantly as well as eloquently, that we absolutely have to drastically reduce our carbon emissions to stop global warming. You don't have to be a scientist to read that bottom line and to see the writing very clearly on the wall. I always retain from my early campaigning days in the women's movement in the 1970s, that slogan which was slashed across walls and windows, you don't have to have a degree to read the writing on the wall. And I think that is really, really clear. And when Joan and I were talking earlier today about this evening's panel, Joan, if you remember, I mean, you were saying that we have decades of science behind us and beneath us and around us, and it's ongoing. We don't have to do that work if we are not scientists. What we have to do is to get out there and put pressure on our government, our own government and governments internationally, on our leaders, to actually make the changes that we have to make to halt curb carbon emissions. And we've got to do that in jig time. We've got to reduce them by almost a half within 9 years by 2030, and then to reduce them even further by 2050 in order to slow it all down to 1.5 degrees. And it's for that reason, and it's a very simple reason, that on Saturday, not just in Dublin or Cork or Limerick or Galway or Derry or wherever around the country, it's not only there that we will be out marching, but all over the world, people will be out on the streets calling for climate action to save our planet. And I pick up on Dylan's point about the feet on the street are so important. And we're calling in the COP26 coalition for 3 very simple things. Sinead has already addressed them, obviously action, but the 3 specifics are climate justice, system change, and to take note of the power of the people. In Ireland, you know, we could have had a list as long as your arm, but some of the specifics that are on that programme of calling for are free and increased public transport. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing Jennifer's remarks later on the government action plan. I want to hear more about the action. The planning is fine. It's the action that's really problematic. So climate justice, system change, and that power of the people. Free and increased public transport, emergency retrofitting of homes, banning LNGs, liquefied natural gas, and stopping the development of fossil fuel infrastructure. And I very much like Sinead's separating out of the actual producers of the infrastructure and the products and those who are consumers, and not given a sufficient or adequate option to change their fuel consumption habits. So we need our governments to take action on those and many more issues, plant more trees. I mean, I could go on. And we need to do it because the lives and the livelihoods of billions of people are headed towards catastrophe. It's not just that they're at risk. I was listening to an extraordinarily interesting man who actually works he's an ambassador, I think, now in the UN. I was listening to him the other night on Newsnight, and he's from Fiji. And he was pointing out that at the moment, they are trying to move 27 coastal communities to safer environments. But of course, they don't have the money to do this. So the point that we keep coming back to is that the actions we need must be backed up by the kinds of finance that's made available on a global basis to enable people to make the changes that they need to make. And if we can't do that, those people are going to experience a catastrophe. And all over the world, we already have a migration crisis. We are going to have a climate migration crisis of really untold and probably quite unimaginable, quite unimaginable extent. One of the figures that frightened me very much is that if we do not halt the temperature rise, that we would, by the end of the century, be looking at approximately 2/3 of the planet which would be uninhabitable. So that would mean that everybody would be living in the 1/3, which does remain habitable, which is possibly somewhere around here. So, you know, I think that that kind of pulls you up short and makes you think about what needs doing. The impacts of all of this, if we don't make the changes, are, I think, already known to us. I won't spell them out in detail, but I do want to make the point that Ireland is not immune. We seem to have this notion somehow that because we live on the edge of Europe and we have a more temperate, cooler climate, that we're going to be okay. But actually, think about it. We're surrounded by sea, we're surrounded by water, as whoever it was, our folk singer, said. And the sea temperature rise is obviously creating enormous problems already for island countries and island communities. We've already seen the problems here. We're already beginning to have quite, by our standards, extreme weather events. So we are not immune for this, although so far we have not experienced the kind of food insecurity that people in so many parts of the world at the moment are experiencing and have been experiencing for some time because of drought, because of heat waves, extended hot seasons, heavier rains in the rainy seasons, making the growing of food and the gathering of food extremely difficult. And there is one other impact which doesn't, to my mind, get mentioned enough, which is that with that, with the catastrophes happening throughout the world, with growing climate migration, we're also going to be seeing geopolitical instability. There is going to be far more instability in governments, in countries, in global relationships throughout the world, which is another reason why those COP meetings are incredibly important for bringing together leaders so that they actually join up to do something practical and specific. The second thing we're calling for, and I'm going to speed up now, is climate justice, because Sinead, I think, spoke about that very, very well. It's so important. We talk about a just transition, and we have to really think very carefully about that word justice, and to make sure that it's absolutely embedded in everything we do, and that the people who are most vulnerable, the people who have least, whether they are here in this country or whether they are in countries which are economically extremely vulnerable as well as geographically, that those people do not end up paying the heaviest price. And that we have to watch particularly carefully, because even if we just think back, well, not think back because we're still in it, but think about what happened during COVID, during the pandemic, that the inequalities on a global level that we know of and that we see here in our own country, those inequalities were deepened and exacerbated by the pandemic, so that those who were most at risk actually were those who were the poorest, who were the most fragile, who were the most vulnerable, who had the fewest protections. And there is absolutely no way in the world or on this planet that we still have and that we have to look after, there is no way that that is going to be somehow different in a climate crisis. We are already in a climate crisis, and we are doing very little for the people in Fiji, for example, or in Tuvalu, or in the Marshall Islands, or indeed the islands in the Caribbean that have been subjected to typhoons and heavy rains. And I could give you the list of 50 countries most at risk, but you certainly don't want to hear me saying that. So that justice has to be built in on a global level. And we also have to build it in when we say to people, oh, we won't need you anymore because we won't need you to be building this or making that or farming the other. What we want to be saying to people is there are other jobs that need doing. And farming, for example, we are still going to need food, but we're going to have to produce it differently. We're going to need different kinds of foods. And there is no getting away from that one, by the way. We are going to need more plant-based foods. There are so many ways. We're going to need far more green engineers. We're going to need all kinds of jobs that we have to now put in place the training and educational process for that. And I'd be interested to see in the plan if that has been mentioned as part of the 125 billion expenditure. In relation to justice too, I was just thinking, about COP26 in Glasgow, that when you're looking at the top tables, we are still in 2021 saying, why are there not more women? Why are we still seeing so very few women? This is absolutely crazy. Women will bear the brunt, particularly in so-called developing nations, of picking up the pieces of the climate crisis for themselves and for their families and for their communities, because they are the heart and the core of the families and the communities. So, we need more women actively involved in the decision-making processes and the planning processes in relation to all of this. And of course, time and again, why not more voices and faces from the global south? And we're still seeing mainly white faces. So, we have to be aware of those deep inequalities in our society when we're looking at planning and organising for the change that we know we need. And that's, I suppose, in a way, really my final point, that we do need system change. We cannot go on living in the world as we're living now. It has to turn around. And I believe that we can make a better world, but it has to be a world that is not based on growth. And again, I'm picking up something that was said briefly, I think, by Sinead and perhaps by Dylan as well, that, let's not underestimate those vested interests who are out there. We wouldn't dream of underestimating them. They are part of a little system which happens to run the world called capitalism. And capitalism will not roll over because their pursuit is one of profit and growth. In order to have more profit, they need more growth. And that is absolutely inimical to the work that we have to do to save the planet. Growth is the enemy of our security. It is the enemy of the well-being of the planet. We have to sustain where we are and go absolutely no further. That's what sustainability actually means. So we cannot go on growing as we are. And every time I go into wherever it is to pick up something new for myself, I say, I don't actually need this. I'm going to have to stop doing this. We have to change so many of our habits, including those very long-standing consumer habits. And that's going to be really tough. So we have to get out there and start retraining ourselves immediately. And I would like to see in the government plan, the plan for actually ensuring that people are convinced of the need to do this, that people understand and engage, that people get actively involved in what should be and what can be a really exciting challenge for us. That is, of making a world which is about sustainability, which is about well-being for everybody, which is about food security and physical security for all, which is imbued strongly with the sense of human rights and equality and justice, and not imbued with this pursuit of profit, the pursuit of growth, the greed that we see all around us, and which I am part of as much as anybody else, I think. We have to see that happening. We have to be able to maintain that momentum. We need our governments, not just here, to have a real understanding of human psychology in actually doing this, and to build into the planning process the voices of people all over. I had been going to say something a little bit about the plan, but I won't, because I'm in suspense to hear what Jen will have to say later on. But also, you know, I do want to say that personally, I remain realistic. I think we have a great deal of work ahead of us, but I really do think we can do it. And personally, I'm absolutely determined to try to play my small part. A young fellow said to me this morning, actually I was doing a young person thing, he said, oh, but, you know, what can I do? I mean, one person can't change anything. And I said, yes, think of it another way. If you do nothing and everybody else does nothing like you, nothing ever will change. So never underestimate the power of the individual to get together with another individual and another. I've always said 3 is the only gang you need to lead a campaign. That's all you need. And the determination to actually gather more forces as you go. So even if you have got something better to do on Saturday, give it up. Come out on the march, Garden of Remembrance, 12 o'clock. Be there, shout, bang your drum. Let the government hear that people want change, we're ready for it, and that we're going to be keeping an eye on them to make sure that we get the changes that we need and that they keep up the momentum we need to drive this forward. Thank you all very much.
Ailbhe, I have to just say huge thank you. I don't want you to feel guilty for another second, because late to the party or not, welcome to the party. You are absolutely the party. So thanks a million. Thank you so much. Jamie, you're up next.
Well, how do I follow that? And how do I follow Sinead? It's a real privilege to share the space with everybody in the panel and with all of the people who are here tonight. All 44 people who I see have given up the time to be here, and it's really important to start with that. You know, that we're part of the solution here, and as Ailbhe says, we need to see all 44 of us on the streets on Saturday, either in Dublin or in your local community. I'm based in Cllr, and I know the local community garden here are organising a thing in the town square in Cllr. So I'm sure there's plenty of things under the radar that we don't know about that are happening besides the main event in Dublin and in Cork. So do get on the streets wherever you are and wherever you can. So I suppose I'll follow it by fleshing out a little bit what climate justice means in terms of the COP currently, and what we need to be seeing coming out of the COP to be able to judge it as a success. And the first thing I want to note is that Joan at the start spoke about this as the last chance we have, and it certainly is a crucial moment, but I would caution us not to describe it as the last chance, because every single fraction of a degree of warming matters, and every single minute matters. And I don't have strong confidence that COP is going to deliver the climate action, the rapid and equitable climate action that we need. And so it's really important for us not to say that if we fail at this hurdle, that we all go home and we do nothing more, because that's not the case. And morally and strategically, it's important to keep fighting, because the most vulnerable, most marginalised communities and groups in Ireland and globally really need us to be doing that, no matter what happens. And one of the really shocking things about this COP, any of these climate negotiations are particularly, as Ailbhe said, and as Sinead mentioned, are often corporately captured. Big industry sponsor these events. Big industry send thousands of lobbyists to the events. The countries that pollute the most often sign up to host the events, giving them the power to shape the agenda. So Poland often hosts the COP whenever it can, in order to, in the past, stymie efforts to limit coal production, which is a really important issue for them. So they're really, really inequitable spaces, very difficult spaces for people for civil society to engage with, for communities in the global south to be heard in, and for the southern states to have a voice in. These are vastly complex negotiations with quite a number of work streams being negotiated at the same time. And so small island states, least developed countries that might only have one or two negotiators at the COP just can't be in every room, in every space, versus the US, which might have hundreds of negotiators, and the EU, which can coordinate across the member states and the Commission. And in particular this year, this challenge has been exacerbated because huge numbers of civil society, which are crucial for holding state parties to account, and negotiating teams have not been able to travel because of COVID-19, because of what civil society is calling the vaccine apartheid. And this is crucial to name here at the outset, because whatever happens at the end of COP, the UK government is going to want to claim this as a victory and claim this as them showing leadership. But they didn't listen to the southern states who asked for this to be this conference to be postponed, and for measures to be put in place to support vaccine rollout in the global south, to allow a proper and equitable COP to take place where everyone could participate. And so the outcome of the COP is already in question, I would say, that whether or not it can be said to be a fair participatory process from the outset. One of the other things, when we get into the detail of the negotiations, that is important to be aware of is this language around net zero, which is being promoted as really the key solution to reducing emissions. And net zero means that we continue to pollute, but we take measures to balance the books in a way, using carbon trading, using technologies like carbon capture and storage, which involves pumping carbon back into the ground, and it's as crazy as it sounds, and another really unproven technological approaches which fall under the heading of geoengineering. And so what justice-focused civil society and the global south state parties are really calling for is real zero over net zero. So rather than the big emitters, big polluters continuing to pollute and hoping for the best with these dodgy market-based mechanisms and unproven science, we need to stop emissions at source. We need to stop drilling. And as Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, said in his powerful speech at the start of this COP, we need to stop drilling, we need to stop digging, because we're digging our own graves. And it couldn't be any clearer, from what he had to say there, that what we really need to be doing is ending the fossil fuel era immediately. We can't afford to be digging any more fossil fuels in Ireland, and in the global north in particular, but we need to also be supporting the countries of the south to move away from the need to use fossil fuels. And as Sinead mentioned, that involves technology transfer, that involves climate finance, and that's all really important stuff that is on the table at Glasgow at the moment. So real zero rather than net zero, and then climate finance is another crucial indicator of progress. And in 2009 at Copenhagen, countries pledged to donate 100 billion per year in climate finance to the global south. That figure was politically derived. It wasn't actually reflective of what was necessary. It's what was possible in political terms to achieve. It was falls far short of what's actually needed to support the global south to adapt to climate change and to respond to the loss and the damage that they're already facing from climate change. And Micheál Martin, in his speech to the COP, very positive speech, a speech that really positioned Ireland as a global leader. But as with all of these things, when you dig down into the detail, we're still acting as climate laggards and claiming ourselves to be climate leaders. So that speech committed Ireland to doubling over doubling its commitment in terms of climate finance from 93 million to 225 million by 2025. I don't know why it's going to take them that long to do that, but it's not today or tomorrow. But in reality, if we were to actually pledge and donate our fair shares of climate finance, we would need to up that by an extra 129 million. So we're still falling short, proclaiming ourselves to be leaders in terms of global effort to address climate change. Then when it comes to Ireland, I haven't. I'm also looking forward to hearing what Jennifer has to say on the plan. I haven't had a chance to go through it in any great detail, but it's clear from the plan that there are no commitments to end mining, no commitments to stop or to withdraw the licenses that already exist. And in that I include both fossil fuel licenses and the new land grab that's going on for mineral resources across the country, with quite significant portions of the country that have been placed under license without community consent, which is a really worrying emerging issue. And they've also sort of fudged the issue of data centers as well, which is really a crucial thing that we need to be aware of, and we need to be challenging. And talking about books from the 90s that I always go back to, Sinead was showing us one earlier, and this is one that I always return to, Guests of the Nation, a classic environmental justice text from 1990 by Robert Allen and Tara Jones, looking at the struggles of communities across the country in response to the industrial development policy, where big multinationals were coming in and given the right to exploit and pollute in favor of a sort of a globalized open market approach to development. So we're continuing to have to fight these battles in terms of development, and development for who and by who and in whose interests is really the crucial question. And for me, as a community development worker, I'm concerned with development that is in the interests of marginalized and disadvantaged communities and groups, that addresses injustice and inequality, that addresses poverty, and has an intersectional analysis behind it, addressing the concerns of women, the concerns of migrants, the concerns of travellers. And we don't see that in the Climate Action Plan as it stands. There is a commitment in terms of broadening the existing programs, CICAP, the Social Inclusion and Local and Community Activation Programme, to include climate justice. But CICAP is very much focused on individuals, very much focused on employment activation, and rather than on the collective, rather than on supporting communities to think for themselves and take action to hold the government to account. And we're seeing that same ethos now in the funding that they're making available for community development in terms of the climate. We've now a commitment for a community climate action programme, and that they're saying that's aimed at facilitating and encouraging behavioural change and voluntary action in communities. And that's just not where it's at. Ailbhe spoke about the power of more than one in terms of campaigning, and absolutely 3 is enough to get us going with a campaign. But when we're talking about large societal change, when we're talking about the rapid transition that needs to happen in a fair and equitable way, it's not about each one of us individually taking responsibility for behavioural change. It's about each one of us coming together to hold the government to account for the structural changes that need to happen. And Bill McKibben, writing about this in terms of climate change, uses a metaphor that I really like. He speaks about it as the difference between addition and multiplication. So addition, gets us so far. If I take action and you take action and our friends individually take action, that's all good as far as it goes. But what we need is multiplication now. We need a rapid scaling up of action, and that's only going to happen with the state taking responsibility and as Sinead says, stopping emissions at the supply end and using the power of the state, the command and control approach, to drive us forward with climate action, rather than placing the burden of responsibility on individuals, because that burden then is most acutely felt on those who are already marginalised in society and have the least resources to take up take that responsibility to buy organic, shift to renewables, and all the rest. So it's a real issue of justice and equity and fairness, and it's something that we need to be calling the state out on in this policy. Sorry, in the climate action plan. So I look forward to seeing you all on the streets on Saturday, and Luta continua.
Thank you so much, Jamie. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm going to read that book, Guess the Nation. And I think Jen is up next with what the government's big plan is. And we're all waiting with bated breath for that one. So Jen, off you go. Tell us what we're going to do.
Oh, thank you very much. I wouldn't get too excited. Look, I suppose I'm going to start off. I always try my best to be positive and to be constructive in these discussions, because I think the difficulties and the issues and the challenges that we face are so big that sometimes it can feel overwhelming. So I always try to start off with these things with a positive approach. And I'm going to bring things back to very much a national level, but it was great to hear Sinead and Jamie and Ailbhe talk about more the global side of it. And I suppose the one positive thing that I have taken out of the last week or last 2 weeks is there has been a huge focus on the issues of the climate. You know, it's all over the media, and there's a real understanding now amongst the community as to what the risks are, and I think what the challenges are, and also what needs to be done. And I think that's a really positive thing. So like, I've worked in this area since the 90s. Yeah, I've been in the environmental sector. So, and this is the first time that I've really seen this level of public engagement. And I think that's a really positive thing. And it's about, I suppose, taking that momentum and not letting the government forget who they're serving and whose interests they need to really be looking after. So the climate action plan, as you all know, was actually, it was released today. Now there's I think 200 pages, but there is a summary doc. So I would imagine a lot of you have actually, heard the high level bits and bobs that are in it. I'll just quickly go through the different sections. The reality is actually this document it's not really bringing a huge amount new forward. A lot of the major initiatives in it have already been announced. We're in the programme for government, or were announced over the last number of years. But I will just quickly go through it. So in the area of electricity, they're looking to increase renewables in wind and solar by up to 80%. So previously it was 70, they've now gone to 80 with that. They're going to bring in small scale generator schemes for farmers, businesses and communities. So from January, they're saying people will be able to actually sell their electricity back to the grid, which is positive. Hopefully that's been a long time coming. So hopefully that does actually get off the ground. And they're also going to renew or review the data center strategy to ensure that the data centers, I suppose, act as part of the grid. So have ensured that they've, district heating components or storage, and that they're conditioned, to ensure that they don't cause as much impact or have as much energy demands on the grid. But there was no definite indication of when that was going to happen, and I think that's, obviously one of the things that we were calling for, a moratorium in the data center approvals until the government really had a grasp on exactly what they meant and what their impact could be from both an economic, social and environmental perspective. For businesses, they're going to obviously accelerate the use of carbon neutral low temperature heating in food and beverages, new obligation scheme to ensure proportion of energy for heat comes from renewable sources, and they have an online toolbox coming up as well. Homes and buildings, again, it's pretty much the retrofitting that they're focusing on. They're going to have a new retrofit plan, which I think is meant to be out before the end of the year. And they say that will drive up demand and make the upgrades more affordable. They're going to develop performance standards to promote low carbon construction, and they're going to roll out district heating, which I think again is, that's a newish thing. So that will be positive, I think, if that gets off the ground. Transport, they're talking about reducing 500,000 travel journeys by 2030 using bus connects, Connecting Ireland, rail services, etc. And again, of course, there's the magic figure of 1 million EVs by 2030. And they're talking about expanding the electrification of bus and rail as well. Agriculture, they're looking at the reduction in chemical nitrogen, the production of biomethane and diversification, but agriculture really hasn't had a huge, as I think we all expected, a big impost placed on them. There's sort of the main things. Oh, the other thing, and this is a positive thing actually, they are going to be establishing a Just Transition Commission, and it will be on a statutory basis. So there was a lot of confusion over this. It was in the programme for government that they were going to do it. They were very slow at, they weren't even really talking about it. And when I quizzed Eamon Ryan on it, he said no, that actually they were moving away from that, a statutory footing, and they would just address it in the climate action plan, but they seem to actually have brought that back in again, which is positive. And hopefully it will be based on the legislation that Sinead worked on with Eamon Ryan and Catherine Martin when it was first introduced, and we actually reintroduced it there a couple of months ago. But that was an excellent piece of legislation, and I will be hoping that they will use that as the base for whatever they bring in. So look, they're essentially the sort of headline things that they're talking about, right? So my concerns with this is when everyone woke up this morning, the first thing they heard was 125 billion investment is going on the climate action plan. And I think a lot of people thought, myself included, okay, perhaps something could happen here with this. What the government didn't make clear was that 125 billion is actually private money. So that represents money that individuals and businesses and companies will actually have to invest in their cars or in their houses or in their businesses to upgrade. So that's not government funding. And I think that that was not made clear. And I think it really, the debate today was very much led by that headline number. And I don't think that was a positive thing for them to do, actually. And I actually think that the fact that they're relying on all these different sectors in the community to put 125 billion in to meet, to achieve these policy goals, or indicates to me that the whole concept of just transition is not going to be applied, that actually the heavy lifting will be done by individuals. And that's my fear with this, because what we've seen at the moment, when you look at retrofitting, the government plan is for 500,000 homes to be retrofitted by 2030. They got 5,500 done last year. Now I know COVID isn't in, and obviously there was delays, but 5,500 is a very, very small figure out of 500,000. There's a 2.5-year delay with their Warmer Homes programme. That's how long people have to wait to get a survey done. And there is a real problem with construction workers and people with the skills to actually do this work. And there is also a big problem with the cost, right? The majority of people are not going to be able to afford to pump thousands into their homes to bring them up to a standard. And I think the government funding that they have in place at the moment is not sufficient to encourage the majority of people to get this done. And I think if they're relying on individuals and families to have that money to pump into their houses, this target is going to fail. So I think that there needs to be a much greater investment by government on this. If you look to Italy, they're actually paying 110% of the cost of retrofitting for each home to encourage people to do it. And it is going to cost billions, but they've decided that we are in an emergency, we need to do something quick, and the government needs to be the main driver for that. Now, I'm not saying the government needs to pay all the money, but I think that they need to make it much cheaper for people to retrofit and recognise that the majority of people in this country are stressing about paying their mortgages, stressing about paying their childcare costs, that there's so many other issues that retrofitting will not be at the top of their agenda. When it comes to transport, I also am nervous about their ability to meet the targets, because again, I think with the EVs, I think the majority of people can't afford it. I also think it's not a good use of our subsidies to be putting a lot of money into EVs in, primarily wealthier urban areas where there is actually pretty, good public transport available. There are many, many parts of this country where there is no public transport. And I think that's where really that subsidy should be directed towards more rural areas to give them the infrastructure and also the ability to purchase EVs, you know, to facilitate them getting around if they can't access public transport. But there's no targeting, there's no, you know, this document isn't that nuanced that it has any sort of, you know, specific targeting of these measures like that. But I do think that's important. I think the government had actually, it's been costed something, 10 billion will go into EV subsidies, which essentially is a subsidy to the car manufacturers, you know. So I do think there is a better way of using that money. In transport as well, you know, they talk about the Connecting Ireland plan, which was launched last week. Now, I think this will be a game changer if there was sufficient investment put in it. The whole local link concept, where you have community buses that go around towns, go, you know, around villages, between all the different centres, friendly community buses where elderly people, school children, everyone can walk out their door and within 10-minute walk hop on this bus and get it around. Like, I actually, if that was available and if it was low cost or free, I think that would be an absolute game changer for our rural areas and our, you know, our towns and actually, you know, even the more urban areas. And I had hoped that the NTA was going to bring something when they were talking about the Connecting Ireland plan. I had hoped that they were going to be doing something on that basis. But the Connecting Ireland plan, whilst they say it will enable 75% of people in rural areas, that it will give them access to public transport, it's a 5-year programme. And so the first year, all the funding they got from government for that was 5 million. Like, it's just a ridiculously small amount of money if what they're trying to do is encourage people out of their cars and to give them different options. Like, 5 million is just, you know, so that in itself would make me question whether or not the government are actually really serious about this, that they need to be pumping investment into things like transport, because there is going to be a delay, right? There is going to be infrastructure needs. There will be a time to roll it out, and the clock is ticking, you know. So that's another issue with it. And then the other core thing that they're really, really relying on is the wind energy and the infrastructure for that. And again, I think there's a risk that they're assuming that that's all going to be in place by 2030 to enable 80% of our electricity use to be renewable. That's assuming that all the auctions go okay, that the legislation is in place, and that the planning process is smooth for all of these, I suppose, essentially developers who are developing these wind energies. But the reality is that the process that they've used for under the planning, I think, will mean, because they haven't brought in environmental protections prior to their planning process, I do think it will mean that it will be challenged, and I think there's a risk that these wind farms will be, you know, find it a more difficult path. And if there's any delay in those, we saw even this morning that one of the big operators pulled out of the market for the offshore wind farms on the west coast. If there isn't certainty for them, they're going, you know, they're huge developments, right? If there isn't certainty and clarity for them as to the process and how long it's going to take, they're not going to hang around. And I think there's a real risk that the government is predicating its entire plan on the fact that this generation capacity is going to be available offshore. And so my concern with it all is that there's sort of there's a few key things that they're doing that there is a risk that they will not be able to achieve them, whether it's through lack of investment or you know, planning issues. And then what is their contingency plan? What is the, you know, break glass, we will not be able to meet our 2030 targets, and at that point then what do we do as a country, because we won't have time to get everything in place. And at that stage then, is it a thing where we will really end up looking to agriculture to make the big savings? And I think that would be very unfair for people in rural communities and the farming community, that potentially they will not be prepared to deal with the challenges or the changes at that stage that we may be putting on them. And, you know, I said this to the Taoiseach yesterday, that I would rather they were more honest and upfront with farmers. Farmers are really, really good, if, you know, at doing what the government wants them to do and doing what the government is going to pay them to do. And that's why we are in the situation where we are, because government has continually incentivized them to do the wrong things. for the environment. It's a very heavy production model that really overrode any of the environmental considerations, and that was because the government forced them down that path. I think it is unfair at this stage for government to tell them, well, you may have to pivot, but we're not going to, you know, really help you carry that can and give you the supports, whether it's technical supports or financial supports to enable them to do that. So like I was saying to the T-shirt, like, you know, but then pretending that this isn't going to be an issue for the ag community, I think it's doing them a disservice. They're going to need their businesses, they're going to need time to prepare, they're going to need time to make the changes, and they're going to need the money to make the changes as well. And that would be my fear with that. So look, they're my thoughts. I mean, I was really hoping to come out of the briefing today and you know, feel, look, at this is great. And I suppose the one thing the Climate Action Plan does, it has brought all those policies and all those things together, right? And if it all works fine, and if the government managed to implement it properly, it is calculated that it will meet, you know, we will meet our targets using those measures. And so our job is to make sure, and my job as opposition spokesperson is to make sure that they are doing everything on time, and in as just a fashion as we can force them to be, because we cannot have a situation where there's a whole group of people in our community, whether it's farmers or people on low incomes or migrants or whoever, who are left behind and feel really excluded and cannot afford to move forward towards this, you know, this hopefully new sustainable future that we could potentially have. So look, there's my bit on that. So if anyone's any questions, work away.
Jen, can I ask a quick question? I'm being very rude now here, getting in first, but there are a lot of concerns about, you know, what's been kind of termed now as big wind, you know, and all of, I know you mentioned there about, you know, planning permission and environmental impacts, but there's all sorts of issues around, you know, the batteries, you know, how the stuff for batteries is mined and all of that kind of stuff, and where we're going to get it from, the lithium, sorry, and then, you know, the safety concerns about the storage centres and all of that kind of stuff. And I know you're talking about a plan B. Like, have we any idea what a plan B would be if we decide that's not a good idea?
To be honest, no. I mean, look, I suppose I'm hoping that over the next few months, so the process with this now is the council's targets have to be debated in the Dáil, so it's going to take 4 months, and then the sectoral targets will go to the committee, and I'm on the climate committee, and we'll get to discuss that. And I'm hoping that through that process, where we're actually looking at each of the sectors and what we will expect them to achieve, that through that we should be able to come up with some alternatives, or some, you know, have a better understanding of the accounting and the figures and everything like that. Like, it's, look, this is a very complex area, even though, I worked in it a long time ago. It is really complex, and I'm hoping that actually through those discussions, we'll get the experts into the committee, that we will have that better understanding. But I really do think we need that plan B when it comes to this issue, because if one of those things falls over or is delayed, there is a risk we won't meet our targets. And it's not even, it's not even like, there could be fines or anything. It's not about that. We just need our environment needs us to do this, and we're already too late in doing it. The other thing I meant to mention as well, that what I would have liked to see with this climate action plan, is that it was launched in conjunction with the biodiversity plan, because I think the two of them, and this is always a thing that I've said, that the two of them need to be running parallel and very much integrated. And I do think there's an opportunity for us to strengthen our biodiversity, but also strengthen our carbon, natural nature-based solutions, carbon storage through kelp beds and seagrasses, and proper marine protected areas and peatlands, and I think actually it would have been a lot better to have those two plans launched at the same time, where you could actually see the interactions between them, and that hasn't happened. But look, but I think that could be something as well. Like, whilst we're going down this sort of very much emissions reductions front, I would also like to see a lot of research and a lot of work. Well, actually, we probably don't even need the research, the scientific research for this anymore. We need funding to be given towards nature-based solutions as well, so that there is a sort of more natural development of those sorts of projects to try and make our environment more robust in case things do go a bit more pear-shaped, you know.
Yeah. Thanks. There's a question in there from Paul Mulville. Why is the government so slow to introduce what would be hugely popular and transformative climate change steps, e.g. public transport for all?
I don't know. Like this is what I don't understand is, if you were to say to people, okay, government is going to pay, or is going to, you know, pay substantially for you to make your home really comfortable, right? Where you know, you don't have to worry about high fuel costs, and it's in the winter time, it's just a nice place to, you know, be with your family. People would go for that, right? But they need to be, it can't cost them an arm and a leg. If the government was funding it, you know, they would do it. Same with public transport. If it was free, or now I think maybe with having it fully free at this point, we probably wouldn't have the capacity. But they could have it free off peak, and that would actually encourage people to use public transport when it's not as busy. It would make a more efficient use of whatever infrastructure we do have there. Or they could make it free for school kids and for kids, right? Because then you're creating a cultural shift where those children just get used to using public transport, and it's not such a you know, big thing for them not to buy a car. And I don't understand why they don't do it. And I don't think it's just an investment issue. I don't know if it's an ideological thing, or but it just makes complete sense to me. And even simple things like, you know, like solar panels on schools only get 50% of the grant for that. Like, why don't they pay for them on all the schools? Because the government pays for the electricity bills, right? So, you know, so it just doesn't make sense. And it's this sort of joined up thinking. I think sometimes government silos issues. So you have, you know, the solar panels on schools will either be a planning issue, or it will be the Department of Education issue, but it's not a Department of Environment issue. And I think that's when you have, I think that's the problem. I think it's all very specific budgets, and never that, you know, they'll never sort of cross over. And we also need to get away from that kind of thinking, because we're not going to solve this issue if we see the issues of the environment as separate from everything else. Environmental sustainability, climate and biodiversity across every sector, you know, I mean, health and education and just every sector. And unless the government is itself going to have that cultural shift in its thinking, it's going to be very difficult for us to do this in a proper and fair way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. There's another question in here, and it's very interesting. It's about nuclear energy. And again, I probably went to one of my first protests. Do you remember you two did Rock Sellafield? So anyone my age thinks nuclear is an awful idea. But the question is, I would like to hear the panelist's opinion on nuclear energy. It is rarely, if ever, discussed, and yet surely a possible solution to emission-free energy production.
Yeah, if I can just quickly, so I just want to say thank you. Those speeches were all amazing. I had the privilege of going first, so I could hear everybody else. It was great after and relax. It was really good. Thank you so much. And great to hear the climate action plan overview as well. And Ailbhe, don't worry about not doing enough. I mean, you've been doing more than enough on other areas, which mean that we're now at the point where we can talk about socially just climate action. So it's not just climate first, which, I mean, never actually ends up being climate action first, means the wealthy first. But in terms of nuclear, yes, so so nuclear has kind of been taken up as like an opportunity now with talk about climate action, that we go to nuclear because of the issues with so-called variable wind. So, I mean, I suppose what I would say is that first of all, there's the kind of what Jen is talking about here about like a biodiversity linked climate approach, and we still don't really know what to do with the waste from nuclear waste. You know, we're already at the moment, there's kind of a there's a duty on states that they can't export their nuclear waste to other countries. So that's kind of like a big actual pressure on why Ireland actually banned nuclear waste. Because we were a poorer country at the time, and we were forced by international law to store it in Ireland. What you're finding in the UK is that they're looking to kind of poorer communities. They were looking to parts of Northern Ireland to bury the waste. They look to kind of marginalised communities and bury it there. And what we could end up seeing, I suppose, in terms of seeing nuclear as the option for climate action, is similar to what's happening with plastic. So plastic doesn't have a similar kind of international law or rule that you can't export it. So all our plastic is being produced, and is being used in our kind of richer countries and then exported to China or exported to poor countries. We're ending up with potato packets ending up in the, in rubbish piles in the Maldives, like from the 70s and 80s. And what will happen is kind of there'll be pressure placed in developing countries to store our nuclear waste, which we don't need, because I suppose the question is as well in terms of energy, is that like, what is the energy that we're all producing for? I mean, if you even think of data centers, if data centers are going to be 70% of our peak grid demand by 2030, what are they doing? What is the energy for? Like, why would we opt for nuclear energy if that nuclear energy would be used to target ads at teenage girls and make them feel terrible about their weight? Is that what energy is for? Is that what carbon space is for? There should be a reorientation of our energy systems, that they're guided towards, as they were up until the 1990s, for national security, or in better versions such as in Ireland for public good. The ESB had a mandate to provide public good, to provide public value to the state, to deliver lives so we could have education and modernisation and better lives for people on farms. And instead it's been a profit-based mandate. And if we introduce nuclear energy, or other kind of intensive forms of energy, or oil or gas, or keep going down fossil fuels, what is it for? Why aren't we focusing on energy efficiency, which is the first renewable fuel, before we even think of kind of introducing an incredibly dangerous type of fuel? Or even, you could say that with anything. Why are we looking at offshore wind? I'm supportive of offshore wind, don't get me wrong, but if renewables lead to more mining, and more mining leads to economic growth, which is causing climate change, you're just in a circular. It's just capitalism. It's just a for-profit method, and you need to have centralized state planning, markets in restricted circumstances, and capitalism in restricted markets where it can work well, but not as a fundamental basis for an energy system when it is causing climate change. That's what I would say.
Thank you so much. Jamie, do you want to get in on that one?
Yeah. Thank you, Sinead, for that. I suppose you really highlighted well there that the energy system doesn't occur in an apolitical vacuum, and that to choose something like nuclear power is not just to lock us into producing nuclear waste, but it's to lock us into a particular model of an energy system, a model of an energy system that's based on big multinational interests, corporate power, and a globalized economy. And so what I would be really urging us to think about is a more cooperative, small scale and local, democratically owned model of an energy system, where community ownership of renewables is a crucial piece of the puzzle, to my mind. And it's great to hear, Jennifer, that finally the government is introducing a feed-in tariff that will pay people for the energy they produce for the grid. It's great to see happening, but it's one piece of the puzzle. And so what I would be advocating for really is a scaling up of those community energy projects, working with the SEAI, working with the likes of Community Power, the new energy company that networks the different community energy projects around the country, so that you can buy your energy from renewable sources, community-owned renewable sources. These are the sorts of solutions that I look to, and I think need to be scaled up rapidly if we're going to meet the challenge of climate change in a just and equitable way that also, as Sinead rightly puts, it challenges the system that got us into the mess in the first place.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree on all that. I think there's a question like, where will we end up if we continue with this? And when I was talking about the data centers, it's the same. It's like, how many is too many? You know, are we just going to keep on allowing them to pop up everywhere because we can meet their needs with renewable energies? But like wind farms, you know, they're not zero cost either. Like there's a biodiversity cost, there's a resource cost to them. And, you know, even, you know, I'm at the point, and sort of people were horrified. We are going to have off the coast of Wicklow a lot of wind farms, and people, I think, accept that they will be there because we need them to meet our targets. But I don't know if they will accept it if they think that primarily they're there to serve the needs of data centers that don't serve any other need other than some, you know, global corporate entity who are making a lot of money out of it. So I do think that needs to be consideration. And then also in relation to nuclear, I mean, we can barely build a children's hospital. I'm not sure whether you know, nuclear would, whether I could see us actually getting something like that off the ground, you know, anytime soon.
And I would just, you know, I'm in the unusual position for myself, finding myself being in total agreement with absolutely everything everybody is saying, and I think it's very true. But one aspect of nuclear power, I mean, it's the old question about, you know, will she use her power for good or for evil? And of course, unfortunately, the reason for nuclear non-proliferation policies and regulation and so on is precisely the fear that it will be used for evil rather than for good. But even an even more powerful argument to avoid it, apart from the rethinking and the imaginative approaches to why we would need to have more energy anyway, that Sinead and Jamie were suggesting, is that nuclear energy would only be available to the rich world. It would not be available to those countries that certainly can't afford to have the kinds of installations that it requires, and also would not have the capacity to regulate and to ensure the security of such sites. So, you know, it's very much a kind of a first world non-solution to a problem which is actually being created by the first world anyway. And you know, just looking at France, which uses nuclear energy, it's you know, people live in absolute fear in those areas that are located near power stations, and it's really very interesting. They're rural areas. Usually, people can't move because they've been farming there for centuries, and they are genuinely very fearful of an accident the entire time. So no. To whoever asked that question, no. Very simple. Can I just say that I thought I really liked your, you know, you're pointing out the weaknesses in the government policy, and it seems to me, though I haven't the plan, although I haven't yet read it, I've only read some of the reports, Jennifer, that the point you're making about that 125 billion, that very, very, very little of that is actually state investment in the kinds of alternative infrastructure that we're going to need. I think that really is the key weakness of that plan, because it does absolutely nothing to change that pursuit of profit and growth, which is the path that we're still very much, even nothing to slow it down. It is about encouraging. And I just find that absolutely incomprehensible. Well, maybe not looking at the government we have, but I find it very difficult to accept that a government in 2021 is de facto refusing to invest in the kinds of infrastructural and systemic changes that we need. Because how intellectually do they think we're going to? We can't do that on the basis of private investment. I mean, it's just simply not going to happen. So it absolutely beats Banagher as far as I'm concerned. And thank you for highlighting it.
Okay, everyone, we've gone way over time, so I'm afraid I can't take any more questions. But just to say again, thank you so much to the panel, and thanks to everyone at the Left Bank for organising this, and the work stream that organises. A lot of hard work goes on in the background trying to get these things together. So thank you, and thanks to everybody for attending. And we'll see you all on Saturday for the march. So thank you so much. Good night.